Good afternoon. Right, so I'm working up in Stepney in East London, and I went for a little walk around the back of the venue to get my van. And a little bit of British history here, this little road. If you look behind me, a very nondescript road in Stepney, East London. But if you look up there, it's written backwards, but it's Cable Street. Now, Cable Street might not mean much to most people, but to Londoners and to the East Enders and to the people of the time, in 1936, this road witnessed one of the biggest riots in British history. And when I was a kid, my best friend's grandfather, he was at the Cable Street riots, and so I used to, as a kid, listen to their stories. He was what's called an anarchist. He was very anti-authority, very anti-system, anti-British, anti-everything. And funnily enough, he didn't like Jews, although he looked very Jewish, which was quite funny, because we always used to take the mick out of him because of that. But he was from up North London, not very far from here, really, in miles. But in 1936, there was an organisation called the British Union of Fascists with a guy called Mosley, and they planned this march through the East End, to provocation, I suppose, because this area at that time was highly Jewish. And there was something, the numbers they recorded, they reckon it was somewhere between 1 and 5,000 British black shirts were going to attend this march, and they were the sort of similar to what was going on in Germany. You had the Hitler's Nazis, you had the Mussolini fascists in Italy, and it was a movement that was right across Europe. And so obviously, there was a lot of anti-fascists at that period, and they reckoned that it was something up to 100,000 anti-fascist protesters turned up that day. There was a whole march by the First World War Jewish veterans that marched, all wearing their medals from World War One, and the police. I think there was something like 5,000 police turned up that day as well. They had the whole mounted division of the Metropolitan Police to come and fight, and they basically want to fight through the anti-fascist protesters to allow the fascists to march. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the government of the time was pro-fascist. It was all about pro-democracy and the allowance of, street protest and all that sort of stuff. So whether you like it or you don't, that's what they have to do as coppers. But my mate's granddad was very anti-police. He used to tell us the stories of the violence of that day, and stay away from big crowds and all that. And I just loved the whole thing of anarchy and smash the system and all that sort of stuff, because we were coming from punk, so anarchist was something that we sprayed it on walls, didn't really know what it meant, but it was anti sort of system. But it sort of makes me think, when you come here, of British culture and what I grew up in, and listening to see my family were the opposite to that. My grandfather was a chief fire officer in London, and he was here fighting the Blitz. So when the Germans were bombing, flattening this place, 4 years later in 1940, my granddad was one of those guys that was putting out all the fires. And when you look around here, those buildings I've just walked by, like those, that's early warehouse buildings, so they're probably 1800s. But if you look behind me here, this is all new buildings, so this would have been a bomb site, because the East End got absolutely flattened. I mean, there's not really many of the old East End left, people wise. I mean, this area now is basically Bangladeshi mainly, so you don't see many of the old cockneys about anymore, which is what it was then. I mean, it was quite a staunch Jewish area, like they say. They reckon there were 10,000 Jews marching that day. So yeah, it's just a nondescript street now, and doesn't really mean much to anybody. But this was one of the biggest street battles, biggest street protests that Britain's ever seen. Obviously, the war broke out 3 years later, so pretty much all of Britain became anti-fascist. Then my family were, very British loyalist, I suppose, would be a description. My grandfathers both signed up. One of them, like I say, was the chief fire officer of North London. He was up in Edmonton, Tottenham area. My other granddad, his family were from this area, from the East End, and he was at Dunkirk, which is when the British, when the French surrendered, the British had to get to Dunkirk beach and came back over to Britain, and then fought on, and he survived. He fought 6 years in the Second World War and survived. But yeah, this is probably an area that if you as a tourist come to London, you'd never even think to visit this place. But you often hear the sort of mythological stories of the Great Battle. You know, anybody that talks about communism, fascism, that type of stuff in Britain, they always sort of the Cable Street riots is the big one that they all talk about. And it's been, I suppose, different points of view will have a different thought on it, you know. But yeah, it was communists, anarchists, fascists, Jews. They all fought here, and yeah, it was mental. But yeah, now it's just a quiet little street. So a little bit of British history there for you.